Hi all, my wife was watching part of one of my videos. She must have been really bored. But she said, with my gray hair, sometimes when I wear a dark, sweater, it's not colorful enough. She said I should wear a colorful hat. Okay. So I thought I would follow my wife's suggestion. We're going to talk about Chapter 30 now, which is Government Budget and Fiscal Policy. Just some things I want to share with you. It's really a straightforward chapter, but I think there are a few things I can add and update some of the numbers and add some of my own thoughts as well. So this being the case, I wanted to mention something called the Laffer curve. It's not because it's funny, but because it was invented by a man named Arthur Laffer. And what Laffer said is, maybe we can cut tax rates. We can give people lower taxes, and the government will get more dollars. Now, how could that be? Well, what Laffer said is maybe they'll take a smaller piece of the pie, but the pie grows so much with lower taxes, in the pie, GDP, so that they're getting a smaller share of a much bigger pie and more dollars. Is this possible? So what Laffer said is, let's talk about tax revenue. This is the number of dollars the government takes in. Let's talk about the tax rate, the percentage of income people pay in taxes. The revenue the government takes in, the amount of money the government takes in, is equal to the tax rate times the amount of income. So what Laffer said is, if the government, we have tax rates on this axis, if the government cuts rates, people work harder, people invest more, and they get more money. So, he said, if the rate is 0, government takes no money, gets no money. If the rate is 100%, nobody works, the government gets no money. So if they cut the rates, more money comes in. And this is what Laffer proposed. This was actually used to justify some of the tax cuts in the 1980s. But there's a problem. It doesn't work. It turns out really the United States economy is over here. And whenever we've cut tax rates like we did in 2017, the result is the amount of revenue, the amount of money coming into the government winds up going down. So I kind of wish it was the case that the government could tax me a lower percent and they would still get more money, but in the real world, we happen to be over here. Well, we've talked a lot about fiscal policy, and I want to point out that there are some doubts or problems with fiscal policy. Suppose the government says what they want to do is spend more. They want to increase government spending. We talked about the multiplier, so they can raise aggregate demand and GDP. We can think about that, in 2009 during the Great Recession, or today, the government says, we're going to spend money and we're going to try and increase GDP. But whenever the government spends money, there are only three, remember, things tend to come in three in this part of the course. There are only three ways the government can get money. The first way the government can get the money that they're going to spend is to raise taxes. But here's the problem. If the government raises taxes so they can spend it, this will cut consumption and investment. In other words, if the government raises my taxes, I'm going to consume less. If we think of a business, think of Amato's Pizza. I'm thinking about a pizza right now. If they wind up raising their taxes, the result is going to be Amato's will invest less. So maybe there's no net effect. Well, but the government has two other ways to get the money. They can print the money. Hey, they can do this. I can't print money if I run short, but the government has the right to just print more money. So they can print money and spend it and stimulate the economy. The problem, well, we've talked about this before. In Venezuela and Zimbabwe, you have inflation when the government just prints money and spends it. Here's the amount of money in Zimbabwe that was needed to buy this amount of meat. Inflation can really destroy a society. So the problem is that's inflationary. And finally, the government can borrow the money. That's called debt. The government runs a deficit. They spend more than they take in, and they borrow. If we add up all of the deficits, that's the government's debt. It's accumulated debt. And actually, that's what the government's doing right now. The government is spending a lot more than they're taking in. This year, the government will probably spend, believe it or not, twice as much as they take in. And where's the money coming from? They're actually borrowing it. Now, sometimes this can cause a problem. It causes interest rates to rise and it reduces consumption and investment. In other words, if there's a limited amount of money that is available for people to borrow, if the government borrows it because they're offering an interest rate that will, the people lend the money to the government, then the money's not there for you to borrow to go to college, or the money's not there for me to buy a car. This is not currently an issue because right now, as we talked about monetary policy just a few videos ago, interest rates are in fact, they are at historic lows. So this is not a problem right now. The government's borrowing the money. But this government debt, what about it? Well, let's look at the government debt. Who owns it? Well, actually, the Fed owns about 11%. U.S. investors own about a third of it. So when we talked about banks owning treasury bonds, what they're doing is owning the government's debt. Maybe your grandparents gave you a savings bond at one time. A savings bond, that's just part of the government's debt. Sometimes retirees, they say, hey, we want something that's safe and secure. They buy government bonds. In other words, they're buying the government's IOU, and they give the money to the government. So about a third of it's owned by U.S. investors. About a little over a quarter is owned by the U.S. government. You say, wait a second, how can the government borrow from itself? That's a good question. Social Security, for a while, at least until 2000, for a while, takes in more money than it gives out every year. They have what's called a trust fund. People pay into Social Security as they're working. When they retire, they get it out. By law, the only place Social Security can place the money that they accumulate, they don't keep it in the vault, is to buy government bonds, to loan it to other parts of the government. So this the part that's owned by the U.S. government, that's really almost exclusively the Social Security Administration lending the money to the federal government, which pays them back with interest. And you'll notice that about 30% is foreign investors. When the United States buys goods from abroad and all those dollars flow to other countries, one of the things they do is they buy our bonds, they buy our debt. In English, they're loaning us the money. So which countries are the ones that are loaning us money to the United States? Right now, the debt is roughly 21 trillion, and GDP is a little less than that. In other words, if we worked all year and took all the money and used it, it would take all the money from 1 year to pay back the debt. But part of it is owned by other nations. And you can see the single largest holder of the United States debt is China. They own a little bit over 5% of the debt of the United States federal government. It's not that they're being evil or plotting to take us over. Our government spends more than it takes in. So we have to borrow the money, and the Chinese are loaning it to us. Japan was number one for a while. Now they've fallen off to number two. You'd probably be surprised at some of the countries that come in, after that. Brazil, Ireland, Switzerland, Luxembourg, the Cayman Islands. It's a haven where people use that to shelter money from taxes. So, just kind of taking a look at the debt. There are two problems with the debt over the long haul. One is if interest rates go up, which eventually they will, the federal government will find itself spending a great deal of money on interest to pay people back. The other problem is that not only the interest, just as when you graduate, you might have to pay back your debt, the United States might have to pay back its debt. Guess who's going to be the ones paying back the debt? Sadly, it might be you if we ever do wind up paying it back. I don't know I doubt we ever will in our lifetime. But if a nation like Greece, whose debt was approximately 2.5 times the level of GDP, at some point people say, you look like a bad risk. We're not going to loan you money, and that creates real problems. So here's the problem. If the government wants to spend money to raise aggregate demand, raising taxes and borrowing might negate the effect, although now the Fed has kept interest rates so low, that's what they're doing. And printing it is inflationary, kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. There's another problem with fiscal policy. If we build projects that aren't needed, for example, a road, would you really like to have a road running this close to your house? This is actually a road in China. So in other words, if we just spend money, if the government spends money to stimulate the economy, we might be building projects that are going to mess up people's lives. Now, I would probably say at this point, the United States has a lot of needs, from the infrastructure to other things that they could spend the money on, but this is something that people do worry about. Now, just to finish things off, there are certainly doubts about monetary policy. There's problems with that as well. You can't force banks to loan out the money. All the Fed can do is make it easier for banks to loan out the money. The bank can look out and say, look, there's nobody we want to loan it to. In other words, what we call pushing on a string. So if we turn to monetary policy, there's problems with that too. You can't force the banks to loan out money. What if the Fed has different goals than the rest of the population? What if the Fed says, we want to jack up interest rates, bring down aggregate demand, and fight high prices? What if people say, the hell with high prices, we want low interest rates and high aggregate demand, which creates jobs? Well, the problem is, if you don't like the fiscal policy, which is passed by Congress and signed into law and administered by the president, if you don't like fiscal policy, you can vote them out of office. If you don't like monetary policy, tough. There's nothing you can do. The Fed, each member of the Fed is in office for 14 years. Although, as we've said recently, some of them seem to not serve their full term. But anyway, the problem is they're insulated. You can't vote them out. And finally, interest rates don't affect all parts of the economy the same. So if the Fed decides they want to raise interest rates to fight inflation, banks say, that's great. Whenever we loan out money, we're going to make a ton of money. But automakers, if the interest rates are high, people aren't going to borrow money. They're not going to buy cars. When interest rates fall, the banks say, we're not making any money on our loans. And the automakers say, hallelujah, people will buy our cars. It doesn't affect all parts of the economy the same. Monetary policy will affect some parts of the economy quite a bit. Some will be helped, some will be hurt by changes by high interest rates. Others will be helped and hurt by low interest rates. So just as fiscal policy has some problems, monetary policy has problems as well. You can't make the banks loan out money. The Fed might have different goals, and interest rates don't affect all parts of the economy the same. Okay, well, in the next video, I'm going to start talking about inflation and some of the things we've learned, some of the lessons we've learned the hard way. Take care.